Oh, anti-heroes. They're everywhere these days. They're in most movies. I see them in books. I have some anti-heroes. Your father probably imagines he's an anti-hero. You probably imagine yourself as an anti-hero. I know I do. For as much as people rant about all of the other tropes, I don't think any of them are as prolific as the anti-hero. You might think they are recent. They aren't. The term anti-hero has been around since the 1700s, and even the ancient Greeks have characters that would retroactively count as anti-heroes. I'm no expert on a lot of story traditions, but I'm going to go out on a limb and guess every culture has anti-heroes. But what are they? And more importantly, how do you write good ones? To understand anti-heroes, we need to understand heroes, which means we need to look at the basics of what builds characters for a second. In real life, a hero might be the selfless firefighter rushing into a burning building to save a kid, or the mother keeping her sick child warm through a cold night. The reason is because we think of heroes as being and living the ideal. They have morally clean positions and do morally clean things without seeking for reward or attention. Of course, nobody's perfect in reality, even if there are people who do genuinely try to be completely selfless. Fiction is the one place we can plausibly make perfect people. But those stories are fundamentally dry. The fact of the matter is that perfect characters make terrible protagonists. Remember this check sheet? As a refresher, characters need an internal conflict, personal flaws, identifying traits, and a strong connection to the story. If you fill out the check with the answers for a perfect character, the result is a very dull protagonist. The main reason is that a perfect character would have to have a very lackluster internal conflict, and the flaws would be meaningless. As such, a perfect hero character would be indistinguishable from every other perfect hero character in regards to personality. Now, it can be corrected by writing an imperfect hero and adding some real traits into the spaces of the character check. But as every writer tends to notice, the more flawed a character is, the easier and more fun they are to write, and thus, anti-heroes become appealing. As implied above, there is a common notion that anti-heroes are, quote, realistic. I agree they are more realistic than perfect heroes, but I think calling them realistic as a positive for using them leads a lot of writers going down the wrong road. Plus, a lot of people confuse anti-heroes with imperfect heroes. A proper anti-hero is a character with more negative character traits than positive traits, but whose goals are at least somewhat noble. By my measure, the most popular true anti-hero is Han Solo. He's a smuggler and arguably a mercenary. He's focused on his own self-interest and primarily works for pay and pay alone. His personality is abrasive, and he's not above lying and cheating for gain. Yet, he ultimately decides to help the rebels and falls in love with Princess Leia. He passes the test for being a true anti-hero, which is the ability to truthfully say, this character is a selfish jerk, but at least they pulled through by the end. So, does that mean there is something that would classify as a fake anti-hero? Yes, and they're more common than real anti-heroes. Anti-heroes are generally associated with a certain aesthetic. You know, roguishly handsome, utilitarian but still stylish. They're rough but not really evil, jaded, and they're usually nomadic or at least always ready to leave their home. Captain Jack Sparrow, the Man with No Name, Arthur Morgan, and the aforementioned Han Solo are great examples of true anti-heroes, and it should be pretty obvious why. So what about Jyn Erso, Walter White, Pete Mitchell, and countless others? Well, aesthetics aren't everything, and they aren't what make anti-heroes anti-heroes. Those three fail at a critical balance to actually earn the classification, so let's look at them. Jyn Erso from Rogue One seems to fit the description at first glance, but when she's involved with the rebels, she sticks to a general code of conduct where she doesn't do anything particularly morally questionable. Underneath the aesthetics is a good person through and through. Walter White has the opposite problem. His actions are morally questionable at best, but regardless of his claims that he's doing everything for his family, by his own admission at the end, it was actually because of his own selfishness and ego. So there is no truly noble goal, and we have a case of a villain as protagonist. Pete Mitchell, or Maverick, breaks the rules like an anti-hero, but he never really does so for his own gain. At worst, he does sketchy things for fun, but he usually does what he does for the sake of others. So, what is that balance? Well, let's explore what I assume is the canonical version of Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2. He's a hardened enforcer in an outlaw gang. He robs, he kills, he lies, he sharks. By his actions alone, he's not really a good man. But even though he does a lot of it for himself, especially early in the game, he also does it for the good of the people in the gang. He has a vague sense of a cause to fight for, and it directs him to pick his fights accordingly. And as his leader and father figure starts abandoning all pretenses of a common good and focuses on himself, Arthur instead starts to become more selfless. He continues doing questionable things, but his overall goal is less about himself and more about saving who he can from the gang, like the Marston family. The trouble with the anti-hero aesthetic is that it can give off the impression of enough surface-level imperfection that not enough is done to actually give the character imperfections that matter. Thus, the most common form of failed anti-hero is the dreaded Mary Sue. Now, the term Mary Sue has been thrown around a lot in recent years, and I think people have lost track of what exactly a Mary Sue is, and why they are a fundamental problem for any story they appear in. For one thing, Mary Sues do not have to be female. There are male Mary Sues as well, it's just that the trope is named after a character who was an early notable example. Now, it might seem off topic for me to bring the Mary Sue trope up in this video, but it's a lot more relevant than you might initially think. See, the hallmark of the Mary Sue trope is a character that is perfect. Most can be caught quite easily if they are written in a straightforward manner, as any character that's perfect in appearance, perfect in every action, perfect in every decision, possesses high knowledge in every field of study and outperform actual professionals, and every protagonist character loves them and every antagonist character is completely wrong in their dislike of them and will notify every writer that a Mary Sue has appeared. The anti-hero aesthetic tends to hide Mary Sues enough to slip through the cracks. Let's return to Red Dead Redemption 2, but instead look at the character of Sadie Adler. She joins the gang without much choice, but by Chapter 3, she's already showing her true colors of being a very capable enforcer. So, is she a real anti-hero or a Mary Sue? I argue that she's a real anti-hero. The key is in how the story operates when it involves her and when it doesn't involve her. There's no difference. She never knows anything that wouldn't make sense for her to know. She never does anything that doesn't make sense for her to do. She was a homesteader, and so she knows survival, but not necessarily crime. She's brave, but she doesn't necessarily know how to be an outlaw. So in Chapter 3, we see her actually learning from other characters, which is something a Mary Sue does not do. Her abilities get better throughout the game as she's forced to react to new situations and learns how to overcome them. Now let's look at Paul Atreides. I'll admit that I haven't read Dune, so I'm going off of the movies Part 1 and 2. But I will say he fits the mold of what I'm looking for here. He's aesthetically an anti-hero, but his abilities are hard to actually explain. Granted, we do see him practice fighting skills, and it's clear he's also well studied, but his portrayal really pushes the line on entering Mary Sue territory. In fact, it's easier to list the things that imply he's not a Mary Sue than to try and list everything that implies he is. He's always right, he always wins, the rules always seem to work in his favor. You can't fault his decision-making. So, how do you write a good anti-hero? First, either start them with nothing or reduce them to nothing. And before anyone else points it out, yes, I am aware Paul Atreides was reduced to nothing. But my counterpoint is that it didn't inconvenience him for very long. Anyway, the anti-hero can only be born from grit and not from gold. They begin as the one under the boot. Their experience as the loser of society will influence the character check. Their contradiction will be some variation of wanting things to be better, but not necessarily being the one to make things better. Alternatively, it can be someone who knows things should be better, but they are presently taking advantage of the current status quo for their own gain. Flaws pretty much need to include genuine selfishness and willfully ignoring reality. That's why real antiheroes are always disliked by the other protagonists when they're first introduced, and it can't be a playful disliking, it has to be genuine. Any alleged antihero that is simply accepted by other protagonists is a red flag. All of that might sound annoyingly restricting, but just remember that every good character in fiction will follow certain rule sets. The irony of anti-heroes is that they are always against established rules and systems, but like all other characters, they are governed by the standards of good storytelling. The rules of fiction are to help push writers to come up with creative ways to tell a story, instead of continuously writing the same power fantasies over and over. Anti-hero please no steal OCs are always cool to the creator, but if you want your characters to stand out, you need to make sure you develop your characters in a way that moves beyond simple aesthetics. Han Solo and Sadie Adler are both perfect examples of anti-heroes, and that can be clearly seen by how many similarities they have, but nobody would claim they are the same character. They have their own motives and beliefs, even if they serve their respective plots in similar ways. The most important thing to consider when writing an anti-hero is making sure your story can actually accommodate them. Notice how true anti-heroes are almost guaranteed to be outwardly rebellious. There are no anti-hero IRS agents, but plenty of anti-heroes that would never pay $1 of tax. Anti-heroes can only really exist in a plot where the establishment is a direct adversary. The only exception I can think of is if the story is a comedy and one of the protagonists is intended to be overly suspicious of everything. Something else to consider is that anti-heroes are usually best placed in the position of a secondary protagonist. That might sound confusing considering just how strong the character development potential is for anti-heroes. They seem like the perfect main characters, right? Well, not really, especially not in first person. Anti-heroes generally have very similar personalities, so a first-person perspective can make them feel generic unless you are particularly careful with the specific design of everything. Additionally, part of the draw of anti-heroes is the mystery of why they are the way they are. I mean, it's possible to pull off first-person anti-heroes, of course, but I don't recommend it for amateur writers unless you are wildly confident in your character design. First-person limited perspective is very popular, and so are anti-heroes, so by numbers alone there are just so many of these stories on the market, and you're forcing yourself to create a mystery that's already been solved 1,000 times. Anti-heroes also require a story with a lot of action. Mind you, action does not have to be fighting, but the point is that anti-heroes are typically characters of few words or at least very intentional words. They are almost non-philosophical on principle. If you want to write some really artistic story that dwells entirely in internal matters, especially if the external setting is confined to 1 or 2 locations and you only have 1 or 2 characters in total, then an anti-hero is almost certainly not the way to go unless you have some meta-commentary on anti-heroes planned. An anti-hero that does nothing is just a complainer and a jerk. I hope this was helpful for anyone interested in writing an anti-hero. Just remember that anti-heroes are more than the associated aesthetic and require a lot of careful work underneath in order to work properly, and you'll be fine. This series will continue to be uploaded on Saturdays, and there are other videos that will be released between some installments. The next Saturday upload will be a closer look at the Mary Sue trope, how to avoid it, and how to fix characters that are stuck in it. Keep writing.